choice for that ever reducing number of very, very unfortunate people.
I call the Minister.
Thank you. Well, I think all sides of the House are agreed that this issue has to be resolved. And I know that perhaps what the Deputy is alluding to is removing the statute of limitations. But the AG's view on that is quite clear. That would have serious consequences for the government in a whole range of areas beyond this particular issue. I believe we do need to resolve this. I hope that this report will help in that regard. I would absolutely agree that the report should be published on its completion when we've had time to digest it. I do not intend to delay. I am aware of the fact that, as you say, many of these ladies are going on in years and would like closure of this issue. And that's what we would seek to bring. And we will have to find a methodology that allows us to do this, notwithstanding the tight financial constraints that are on the government at the moment.
Come on. I have Deputy Wallace, Deputy Quayle and Deputy Keller offering. So very brief. Deputy Wallace.
Yeah. Minister, just to correct the mistake I made earlier when I was my earlier question, I actually meant to say inquest rather than inquiry, and that's why you might have been a bit surprised at my question. But on this issue of instant physiotomy, I have to agree with Deputy Quayle on that time is actually running out for a lot of these people, and I noticed there recently that the English authorities have announced a police investigation into the Hillsborough disaster, which was actually 23 years old, and maybe we might follow their example on physiotomy. It wouldn't go astray.
Come on, Deputy Quillan.
I agree and accept the Minister's point that concern in relation to this matter is shared right across the board in this chamber. And I want to acknowledge the commitment of members of both government parties in relation to the all-party group. Their contribution and their commitment to resolving this issue is unquestioned. I would ask the Minister to accept that whatever legal advices may be presented, that there is equally, arguably, longer standing legal advice, eminent legal advice available that gives a very, very different view.
Come on.
It will be a tragedy that because of a particular legal interpretation that any of these women will be denied what must be theirs as a right, and surely that is something that we can collectively aspire to achieve and deliver as early in 2013 as possible, and I hope the Minister will give every favourable consideration to that appeal.
Deputy Kelleher,
briefly. I mean, Minister, this issue has been discussed. We've had an all-party motion in the floor of the chamber here. There was unanimity among parties and government parties and opposition alike that some issue or some way of addressing or giving redress to these women would be brought forward. So, look, I would urge the publication would be made as quickly as possible, and that there will be some mechanism put in place. Because all deputies are right. I mean, their stories are chilling, they're harrowing, they're very emotional, but equally, time is not on many of their side in terms of the age profile of this cohort. So I would know that there's obligations to take into account the legal advice that's given to governments by Attorney Generals, but also some mechanism that addresses the suffering and gives dignity and respect to these people to tell their story, share their story, and to seek redress.
Come August.
To assure the Deputy Office and the ladies concerned that there are the difficulties that I've outlined, but where there is a will, there's a way, and I'm determined to find that way.
Come August. Cleiste Hucht is in the name of Deputy Peadar Tobin and Tara Stodge.
The prices of drugs vary between countries for a number of reasons, including different prices set by manufacturers, different wholesale and pharmacy markups, different dispensing fees and different rates of VAT. In recent years, a number of changes to the pricing and reimbursement system have been successfully introduced in Ireland. These have resulted in reductions in the prices of thousands of medicines. The Department and the HSE have successfully finalised discussions with the Association of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers in Ireland, the APMI, which represents the generic industry, on a new agreement to deliver further savings in the cost of generic drugs. Under this agreement, from the 1st of November last, the HSE will only reimburse generic products which have been priced at 50% or less of the initial price of an originator medicine. In the event that an originator medicine is priced at less than 50% of its initial price, the HSE will require a generic price to be priced below the originator price. This represents a significant structural change in generic drug pricing and should lead to an increase in the generic prescribing rate. In addition, the Health Pricing and Supply of Medical Goods Bill 2012, which is currently before the House and completed second stage this week, provides for the introduction of a system of generic substitution and reference pricing for prescribed drugs and medicines. These reforms will promote price competition among suppliers and ensure that lower prices are paid for these medicines, resulting in further savings for taxpayers and for patients.
Ara, I'd like to know when you expect the arrangement that you've outlined to us to take effect. The situation heretofore certainly is that some generic substitutions in relation to originator medicines are costing in the order of 96 to 98% of the originator medicine cost, which of course is a very marginal saving indeed, and totally defeats the exercise of replacement and whatever savings can be accrued. If the Minister could outline from his reply the action that is being taken to give effect to the commitment that he has outlined to us here. And in relation to the Health Pricing and Supply of Medical Goods Bill, that only presented here again on Monday of this week in order to complete second stage. There is some concern in relation to this particular legislation that there does not appear to be the same sense of urgency applying to it. I mean, quite a raft of legislation has been rushed through in these last days before the Christmas recess. Would this not have been a bill that would have required moving on to committee and report in final stages much more quickly? Would the Minister like to indicate how soon we will actually have the opportunity to address the Health Pricing and Supply of Medical Goods Bill at committee stage?
Minister.
The answer to the two questions, essentially the two questions are one, because the regime that I'm talking about in relation to generic substitution, of course, is to be governed by the legislation that the Deputy refers to. And that sets in place, the legislation itself, of course, doesn't purport to arrange these substitutions. It gives the Irish Medicines Board the power to do so, and there's the regime set out in the legislation, as the Deputy is aware, in order for that to be achieved. Can I just say, though, that secondly, that in relation to the passage of the legislation, the second stage completed this on Monday afternoon, as the Deputy correctly said, and it's now has been referred by the Dail to the Health Committee. It is my view and my earnest wish, and that of my colleague Minister Riley, that legislation would be expedited as soon as ever possible. And there's absolutely no wish, the contrary is the case on my part, that for there to be any delay in the passage of that legislation, regarded as a priority. But there is an enormous volume of legislation in the system at the moment, as the Deputy will be aware, including in the area of health. And there have been difficulties in attempting to expedite different bills before the Houses. But in fact, we were, if I may say this without overextending the point, we were fortunate that in fact we had time available this week on Monday, because the House was in any event sitting to do other matters, so that we were able to actually get the matter in on Monday afternoon. So we're doing everything, and Minister Riley himself has, well, I won't put the point too far, other than to say that the quicker this can be done, the better from our point of view as well. And there's absolutely no sense of any delay. There are 4 health bills currently in the system in the Houses. It's an extremely important piece of legislation for the reasons that I outlined in my reply, for the reasons that I think Deputy O'Quillan, in fairness to him, supports, as he did at second stage. And anything we can do together to have this legislation through the Houses quickly, I think will be in all our interest.
Deputy O'Quillan.
I will recommit to offer every support for the fast tracking of this legislation, which I do, of course, support. And we should use this opportunity to indicate to those who may have ideas to improve the legislation. I think that's always the way that we should approach it, certainly as opposition voices in any legislation. If we're not opposed, our amendments then are intent on improving where possible. And we should use the intervening period before the resumption in order to prepare any possible amendments that might present and to be able to expedite its passage. I would welcome a situation being arrived at that mirrored what you indicated in your opening first response, Minister White. I think that's something, that is a position that we would like to get to, and it can't happen, in my opinion, soon enough.
Deputy Keller, briefly.
Yeah, well, Minister, we've also offered support in terms of the medical supply and the pricing bill, and we'll try and encourage the committee to obviously move that along as quickly as possible. But equally, I think it's a piece of legislation that needs a bit of critical analysis as well at committee stage. I mean, there was some price referencing between Ireland and, for example, New Zealand, which showed huge disparities in the cost of drugs. There was a recent survey done. And even with this particular piece of legislation, we are still in a position here in this country where we're completely out of kilter with the norms in terms of pricing of ordinary medicines. We're not talking about the high-tech, high-end medicines. We're talking about everyday, you know, out of the pharmacy prescription drug medicines. And this clearly is something that just cannot be sustained. And I think that, you know, the medical supply pricing bill will deal with aspects of that. But there are other inherent difficulties in the system as well that lead to increased costs of medicines to individuals and equally to the state through the reimbursement scheme.
Minister, you reply?
Briefly, just for the record again, to point out there has been considerable progress in relation to this broader area on the question, for example, of the agreements with the industry. There have been savings made there. Not as quickly maybe as all of us would have hoped. They have in fact now been done. They have been put in place, these agreements. They will yield considerable benefit to the taxpayer and indeed to patients in the year ahead and in the years ahead. And I want to thank also Deputy Kelleher, in addition to Deputy O'Quayle and the other deputies who have supported, I think, the rationale behind this piece of legislation, which is finally getting a grip on this issue at a level of legislation and putting in place a system and a regime where we can actually make happen what people have been talking about for so long.
Come on with Ara. Question in the name of Deputy Peter Doherty, number 9, Minister Riley.
Emergency ambulances from all stations across Donegal are used in a dynamic manner to maintain emergency cover and respond to calls as required. Ambulance stations across the county and adjacent counties support each other, and the nearest available resources respond to an emergency call regardless of where it is based. And I'd be the first to acknowledge the geographic spread that is in County Donegal. The National Ambulance Service has enhanced the delivery of ambulance services in the North West through the recent introduction of a new intermediate care service in Sligo and Letterkenny. The purpose of the intermediate care service is to undertake routine and non-emergency stretcher-based patient transport, such as inter-hospital transfers, in order to free up emergency resources for emergency calls. So we're back to the principle of the right patient being treated by the right person, the right place at the right time. This carries for ambulance services as well. So this service will be fully operational early in 2013 with 19 intermediate care operatives. At the moment it operates in a limited number of areas, which include Letterkenny. The National Ambulance Service is also assisted in the West of Ireland by a pilot emergency aeromedical service which was established in June 2012 for the first time in the history of the state, and it's based in Costume Barracks at Lone. This dedicated resource provides emergency transport where transport time is critical and where certain clinical criteria are fulfilled. Indeed, I'm happy to inform the House that I've had discussions with Minister Edmund Poots in the north of Ireland in relation to how we can cooperate in relation to air ambulance services, as well as community services across either side of the border and hospital services. And I suppose the radiotherapy services in Altnagalvin are a case in point. The National Ambulance Service is also progressing training of additional advanced paramedics, and a number of staff from North West, including Donegal, are included in this programme. In addition to the above, a paramedic upskilling programme is currently being progressed across the country, which will enhance the delivery of care to patients.
Deputy Quillen, just have time for one question, Deputy.
Well,
My
my attention has been drawn to a report in the Donegal Democrat of Monday the 26th of November, and this referred to the situation where a distraught mother had to drive her unconscious child to hospital while an ambulance man, a paramedic, tended to the child in the back seat of the car. Now, if this was an isolated situation, it might not have been raised in this way. But I am told that there are other reported instances where ambulances have been called and where one paramedic was available, driving and tending. And with the child having to be attended to and brought to Letterkenny General Hospital, the paramedic couldn't drive the ambulance while tending to the child in the back. I mean, the situation is very, very serious. And I'm drawing it to the Minister's attention because I do believe that there is a fault line, and it's not to question the role of individual ambulance drivers and or paramedics, but very certainly it is to question the decision-making of those who either oversee the service or those who have issued governance rules to those entrusted with that oversight. Because what we're told by the article and inquiries I've made on the back of it is that the paramedic in this particular instance sought additional support through the channels that he would report to. And people were available with the necessary skills, other paramedic stroke ambulance drivers, and permission to engage those available other professionally trained personnel was refused. And that this is a very, very serious matter. I believe it is regarded as serious and a matter of significant concern to the paramedic concerned and to their fellow professionals within the ambulance service in Donegal. And I'm asking the Minister what steps he will take to assure the people of Donegal that a situation such as that described in the Donegal Democrat article will not reoccur.
Just before I call the Minister, could I ask Deputy Durkin to take the chair for the next session? Yeah.
While the movements are taking place. Deputy, this is a very serious matter and I intend to have it investigated. It doesn't make any sense to me that an ambulance will go out on its own and have the paramedic unavailable therefore, given the choice between driving or caring for the patient. That just does not make any sense. And I'd like to place on the record here of the House, you know, that I went around the country and met with the staff, including ambulance staff of the regions, in relation to the future plans for the health service. And, you know, one of the ambulance men, who's a paramedic, raised an issue with me, which I intend to address. And that is that sometimes these very experienced individuals are sent to a house for an ambulance call, and when they arrive, having examined the patient, they see absolutely no indication to bring that patient to hospital. And yet, they have no other option. They can't bring the patient to the out-of-hours doctor on call, or advise them to wait until the morning to see their GP. And yet, in my belief, that should be the case. These are very qualified individuals. So, you know, I know it's not quite on the same lines what you're talking about, but what I'm really trying to say is that we do have a wonderful resource here, and we should allow them give of the knowledge they have in a complete fashion and not just corral them into narrow spaces. Again, I undertake to investigate that and come back to you with a report, because to my mind that is utterly unacceptable.
You will come back.
I will.
Thank you. Thank you.
Minister. We now move to a matter selected for topical issue debates. Number one is in the name of Deputy Noel Harrington to the Minister for Communications, Energy and Natural Resources, the need to provide adequate broadband speeds in all areas of the country. Deputy has 4 minutes to make an initial statement, and the Minister and Minister for State has 4 minutes to reply, with each having a further 2 minutes for supplementaries. Deputy Harrington.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I want to thank the Office of the Ceann Comhairle for selecting this topic this afternoon. I think, you know, it's one of those debates or one of those topics that, you know, comes through this House and committee quite often. The idea of providing adequate broadband to this country is something, you know, it's like in a parallel in a historical context in importance to railway, road or other infrastructure in terms of driving economic activity. And broadband, quite quite literally, is absolutely vital in this day and age, not just for personal use or home use, but is so vital now to generate economic activity, whether you live in an urban area or a rural area. And I know that the department and the minister in particular has recognised this, and through the announcement of various schemes recently, like the National Broadband Plan, the National Broadband Scheme, the Schools 100 megabytes projects, the ongoing work with the metropolitan area networks, and indeed the Rural Broadband Scheme is showing a commitment to providing that absolutely vital infrastructure to the entire country. The difficulty or the concern I want to raise this afternoon is the adequacy of the provision of that broadband to certain parts of the country that are proving very, very challenging. I know the European Union and that this country will subscribe to, the European Union has challenged the country to provide a minimum of 30 megabytes per second to every household in this country by 2020, I believe. And quite frankly, I'm concerned that that target is becoming unreachable or becoming very, very difficult to attain. And I just want to, provide a story or a reality that has happened recently in Bantry, in Cork South West, where, for example, the impact that it can have. We recently had, and it was through the endeavours of a local councillor, Councillor Mary Hegarty, who met with representatives of Amazon and said, provided a proposition to them that if they could provide jobs in an area if the technology and the infrastructure was there, and they did. They made a commitment and they delivered, and they provided 26 jobs with Amazon servicing technological aspects of that company. And regrettably, because we couldn't provide in some places 5 megabytes per second, some of those jobs had to go. And the impact that 26 jobs would have had, or has, in a place like Bantry, which is a terrific good news story. The majority of the people were able to take it up, thankfully. The 5 megabytes that they needed was there. But the impact that has had in Bantry, and will have in a place like West Cork, is significant. It's as big in many cases as some of the recent job announcements in the more urban areas. We need to move on. There are many parts of the country, particularly in the rural areas, that just are not adequately provided. The figures that are given, for example, of saying that there's 97% broadband coverage in the country is fine, it's grand when you're talking about, the basic broadband, 1 megabyte, 2 megabytes per second service. It's not enough to talk about economic activity. We've seen in this chamber over the last 12 months and more some intense debates, for example, on the closure of small schools. And small schools don't close because there's a lack of commitment by the Minister for Education, or there's a lack of finance from the Minister for Finance. The simple fact of the matter in rural Ireland, small schools are closing is because there's a lack of children. Garda stations are closing similarly, and banks are closing as well. And the banks bring on a different dynamic. 9 out of 10 transactions done at the banks now are done online. But many of the people that have, for example, a 1 megabyte service, or what we would call a minimum broadband service, is fruitless. It's absolutely pointless pointing them towards online access. And, a lot of the policies that we're implementing through the budget cuts or through the budget corrections can easily be supplemented by talking about investment into an adequate broadband service. And I think, for example, people like James Welton, who's recently figured in the Forbes under 30 list, they get it. They talk about establishing Coder Dojo classes that we've heard about here. They realise the potential for every citizen in this state on the digital technology that and the potential it can bring. And I would appeal to the Minister and his department, push forward on applying 30 megabytes per second technology to every household. You don't have to bring fibre optic networks to every house. You bring them to an area, the technology exists, that you can bounce that then to every household. So I would look forward to the Minister's response. I acknowledge his commitment in this area, and it is an issue. And
Thank you, Deputy.
It needs to be highlighted.
Antara.
Look, the Deputy Harrington is absolutely right about the potential of broadband for economic dispersal and job creation in a region such as he represents, and which I visited very recently for an engagement with David Putnam, who I'm happy to tell the House has accepted the appointment as a digital champion for Ireland. And living in Skibbereen, as he has for the last 26 years, he has arranged a facility there where, for example, he can conduct lectures, as he does every week, with students in Sunderland, students in Brisbane, students in Manchester, from his video conferencing facility in Skibbereen. So there's no doubt about it, Chairman. Deputy Harrington is right about the significance of this technology. In terms of the architecture being put in place by the National Broadband Plan, let me reiterate for the House that the plan targets, timetabled, will put in place 100 megabits for 50% of the population by 2015. At least a further 20% will have 40 megabits or better. And it is mainly, principally, in the third quartile. You can't have third quartiles in 4, do you, for a quartile? The third tier, anyway, will have 30 megabits or better. But it's in that third tier that their state intervention will be necessary, because the private sector will not, in the less densely populated areas of the country, they won't supply the quality bandwidth that is necessary. So in other words, the prospectus that we will draw up will require the successful bidders to deliver 30 megabits or better. Now, I have to say to Deputy Harrington that that will be more than 10 times better than what you have at the moment. There isn't any country in the known Western world, known to me anyway, where there isn't a difference between the bandwidth available to the high-speed bandwidth available to densely populated urban areas, and a difference between that and the very poorly populated regions. I think Holland might be an exception, but that's a very tiny area that is very densely populated. But you have the same, I mean, there's whole tracts of the United States that have no broadband at all. So if we can implement this, the idea is that Tier 1 and Tier 2 will be implemented by the end of 2015. The intention is that in respect of Tier 3, that it'll be implemented by the end of the lifetime of this government. And the reason for it being 2016 is that we have no choice, Cathaoirleach, but to go through the state aids procedure. Because we envisage the investment of state money, we have to go through the state aids procedure. And that is painstakingly slow. I don't know of any short way around it. So we have to do a detailed mapping exercise, which we will be doing, which we're just started. The preparation for implementation next year. So the idea is that by the end of the lifetime of the government, the successful bidders will deliver 30 megabits. And I think Deputy Harrington unwittingly said that that target was 2020. Now that's the European digital agenda, but ours is more ambitious than that if we can deliver, and I believe we can. I would have to say, Cathaoirleach, in conclusion, that there's been some 300 million of exchequer investment in broadband in the last decade, and private investment in the broadband infrastructure across all platforms over the last 5 years alone amounts to 2.5 billion. So there is very significant private investment going in, and there is fierce competition. Now, Deputy Harrington is absolutely right. There are parts of the country where it's very basic, and that's not good enough, because it does offer possibilities of doing business in the regions that was unthinkable before, and it really does have tremendous capacity to keep people in their own areas. In conclusion, Cathaoirleach, can I say that we have connected up some 297 second-level schools now with 100 megabits. and it really does transform the educational environment. We are about to announce the next 200 second-level schools for the second tranche, and by 2014 we will have connected up every second-level school in Ireland to 100 megabits. So progress is being made. There are in contemplation a couple of other very innovative initiatives in respect of the area that Deputy Harrington is interested in. I'm not in a position yet to deal with that, but the House will have noticed that we got some 850 million plus investment from the telcos recently as a result of the spectrum auction, and in turn the 4 successful companies are engaged in preparations for the rollout of next generation access. So there is considerable progress in it, and I thank Deputy Harrington for raising the issue.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Harrington, 2 further minutes.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I want to thank the Minister again for his reply and his commitment to delivering what I know he sees as a vital infrastructure. I want to also join with him and to welcome the appointment of David Putnam as our digital champion. I think it's a remarkably appropriate, brilliant appointment, and I think his passion and his knowledge will bear fruit. I was in his home, and I've seen what he can do, and it's quite remarkable. The reality, I suppose, and I don't want to put pour cold water on it, he can absolutely deliver learning and lectures to people across the globe, and the problem is he can't, in many places, 5 or 10 miles out the road, he can't, and that's the challenge, and I know the Minister is accepting that. And who knows, Cathaoirleach, the day might come eventually where we might spend 4 days in committee in our own homes and give 1 day in plenary in Dublin, for example, and the technology isn't that far away, and it's something that could be considered. And similarly, for example, in campuses, you could be a university student in your own home for the majority of the time, and the economic advantage and the social advantage that could bring to your home life, to a rural area, is something that I don't think we've even contemplated. But I think it's something we need to begin to think about. You have the economic activity that this could generate, you have the social activity, you have the communications. I mean, the globe has become a very small marble, really, in terms of communications, and I'm glad, and I know that the Minister has recognised this, and I'm very glad that my dates are wrong, that the Minister has corrected me, and it's far more advanced than that, and I look forward to the delivery of the programmes as they become on stream, and look forward to a greater quality of life indeed for those people that have been challenged by a poorer service.
Thank you, Deputy. And Tara?
Well, I agree with everything the Deputy has said about the potential and the importance of this in terms of priority policy decision-making at governmental level. I have to say, Cathaoirleach, that colleagues in the department a couple of weeks ago visited a second-level school in what can only properly be termed a socially disadvantaged area of this city, and were amazed to find 5 young women studying honours maths remotely from a teacher in Sculbreda in Clondalkin. And, honours maths was not available in the school previously. The prospect of specialist teachers being accessed remotely has immense implications. And it really does change the classroom as we know it, and it really is worth visiting to see how it functions.
Thank you, Minister. The next is in the name of Michael P. Kitt to the Minister for Health, the closure of the residential centre of Tohermore House, Tuam, County Galway. The Deputy has 4 minutes to make an initial statement from the Minister. Our Minister for State has 4 minutes to reply.
I thank the Ceann Comhairle for allowing me to raise this issue, and to thank the Minister of State for coming into the House. I'm raising, Minister, a question of the possibility of transferring residents, in this case 18 residents from Tohermore House to other centres. And indeed, could I say, Minister, that your colleague, Minister of State Kathleen Lynch, did open part of the centre in autumn last year at Towermore House. It's a very fine facility. There was certainly great praise for the work done there, and a lot of money has been spent on Towermore House in recent years. I don't think it would take much more to deal with fire and safety standards which have been raised now as a particular problem. But I think the idea of moving 18 people out of Towermore is very harsh, coming up to Christmas with no identified centres yet for the residents. So I think we need a better response from the HSE on this issue. And indeed, I know that the engineer's report, which I think has just come in, it does refer to the fire doors, which they say are urgently needed, and I hope that that will be done. But I think effectively we're saying that there is no need to close Towermore if we can deal with the issues of fire and safety. All we hear is that day services and training will continue at Towermore, and I think it's an example of decisions being made at short notice with very serious implications for the users of the health services in County Galway. Just in the past year, we've seen nursing home centres at Woodford and Uachtaráir, to name two, which were closed without any warning. In fact, in Woodford, the closure was over a weekend. So I would like to see the Minister reconsider this question. If there are improvements to be carried out, what is the cost and what does the improvement work entail? And I would like to see a better statement from the HSE than the one that I saw today. I've been referring here to 18 residents, but of course there's a lot more happening at the centre, a lot more activity. There are training places, day places, but you could have up to 50 or 60 people in total who are using the services there. And I think it's very important to point out too that because of this centre, there are no rented properties used in the town of Tuam. And these 18 people have rights like everybody else. It's interesting, the history of Towermore House, I'm sure the Minister knows this, but Towermore House was donated to the state by the late Bobby Burke, and it's now headquarters for mental health services in Tuam and Hereford. And the late Bobby Burke was a Labour senator whose family left the property to the state, a family that's held in very high regard in the North Galway area. And indeed, it has been very cost effective in relation to the other alternative of using rented property. I think it's also endeavouring to cast away, as the Tuam Herald said last year, the stigma associated with psychological illnesses by encouraging people to seek treatment and help, just as they would for any other health complaint. In fact, the staff have said to me that there is an issue here where Towermore actually has prevented admission to hospital, or where there is admission to hospital, it has meant a shorter stay for people in hospital. The historic Towermore House is now the headquarters for this area, and plans are underway to locate other health services such as speech and language therapy and physiotherapy. The campus might also be used in the future by some local voluntary organisations. Extensive renovation and refurbishment works have been carried out on the main house, while vacant, dilapidated warehouses and stores have been transformed into modern clinic rooms, offices and recreational areas. So I think it is a very fine facility. I would certainly not like to see it undermined in any way from the point of view of the residents there, the point of view of the staff. I think we have a very good centre, and I hope the Minister might tell us about the report, the engineer's report, and if in fact we can assure the people that use the services that they will have the residential centre continue.
Thank you, Margaret Hurley. I'd like to thank Deputy Kitt for raising this issue for discussion this afternoon, which I'm taking on behalf of my colleague Minister of State Kathleen Lynch. Tuam Mental Health Services caters for the Tuam and Headford catchment areas with a population of approximately 35,000 and a caseload in excess of 800 individuals. Traditionally, the service was provided at St Bridget's Hospital in East Galway, but gradually over the years, community mental health services in Tuam and Headford have been developed, as indicated by the Deputy. Amongst these services provided by Tuam Community Mental Health Services are a day hospital, which operates 5 days per week as a community mental health centre, a day centre which provides a 7-day service for approximately 30 patients, 1 high support, 3 medium support and 5 low support residences accommodating 40 service users, and Towermore House, an 18-bed residence providing high support to a mixed service user group, including elderly, learning disability, continuing care and respite accommodation. The HSE makes every effort to ensure the quality and safety of all services delivered to patients and staff by keeping such matters under review. As such, an independent fire and safety report in Tohermore House was undertaken in September last, and its final report was submitted to the HSE just last week. The report shows that the current facility does not meet the minimum standards for this type of building in relation to fire safety, and this situation really must be addressed immediately. The HSE has formed a local steering group to assess the challenges outlined in the report with a view to closing the facility as a matter of urgency. The group consists of a cross-section of senior local mental health services personnel as well as patient representation. The HSE will also be liaising with the residents, of course, and with their families as part of this process. The measures on how best to address the fire and safety issues are being discussed at a meeting of the steering group scheduled to take place today, Cahirley, to progress the matter in a controlled and safe manner. The steering group is also considering the relocation of the current residents to the most appropriate clinical settings according to their individual needs, while the safety issues are addressed. Tohermore House remains operational during this process, but ceased any new admissions since last Monday. It's also important to stress, however, that all other mental health services in the Tohermore complex, which Deputy Kidd referred to, which include the day hospital, the day centre, the training centre workshop, primary care and child and adolescent mental health services will continue to operate as normal. In conclusion, Cahirley, Minister Lynch has asked that the Department and that she be kept informed of developments in relation to Tohermore House arising from the steering group's findings. Obviously, it's somewhat of a fluid situation in that regard, Cahirley, but I hope that this at least gives some clarification to the issue as it currently stands.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Kidd.
Well, thank you, Cahirley, and I want to thank the Minister for his reply. It is, as the Minister concluded by saying that it's a fluid situation. I certainly hope so, because I understand that report is just in, and if it's a question of the fire doors, and fire and safety was mentioned by the Minister, I would hope the Minister would agree with me that it would make more sense economically to carry out those necessary repairs, deal with the fire and safety issues, rather than moving people who are very used to that area out of Tohermore House to a centre which doesn't exist at the moment. In fact, I think it's true to say that the HSE would not have 18 places at short notice to be available for the 18 people involved. The Minister mentions there that any new admissions have ceased since last Monday. Again, that's a little bit disappointing, Minister, when you talk about the Tohermore House remaining operational. But it does not make sense to me that we be paying rent, as indeed we do quite many situations in the western area of the HSE West. But here is a situation in Tuam where we pay no rent, because we have an excellent centre which was donated by the late Bobby Burke, and which I think has meant so much to the people of Tuam and to the community in Tuam. And if it's true what I'm told by the staff, that this is a centre which prevents admission to hospital, where it leads to shorter stays in hospital, and particularly removes any stigma of mental illness, I think that is very well worth looking at. And I would hope that Minister of State Kathleen Lynch would take an interest in this. In fact, as I said, just 1 year ago, she opened part of that facility. She unveiled a plaque to commemorate the development of a new integrated mental health campus at Tohermore. So a year later, it would be very disappointing if we're saying now that we cannot continue with the residential centre there. And of course, she did promote on the day the whole question of a vision for change, which she has been endorsing in a very strong way. And she spoke so positively about her commitment to a patient-centred service when she visited Tohermore in autumn of 2011. So I would hope that my views would be given by you, Minister, to her, and that we could hold on to the residential centre there for the sake of the 18 people. As I said, this is coming up to Christmas time, and to say that you're going to remove these people to another centre, I find it very harsh. I'm sure you'll agree with that.
Thank you. Deputy Antara, to conclude.
Thank you, Cahirley. The Deputy makes the case very well. and there's no doubt that in circumstances where people are discommoded and who suffer the upset that is undoubtedly involved when, particularly at this time of the year, but any time of the year where an event like this occurs and where there's a requirement for people to be moved out of a facility that they're familiar with, that it's extremely upsetting, and there's no doubt that if that can be avoided, I'm quite sure it would be avoided. But the HSE and those involved have, as I'm sure the Deputy will agree, have to balance that risk of upset and discommoding of people with the important requirement to ensure the safety, health and safety, but the safety in the first instance of people where there's a risk identified, that there's a requirement and an immediate requirement for that risk to be assessed and for it to be acted upon if it's found to be a real risk. So there's a balancing exercise involved here. I can't really say any more than what I've said by way of reply to the Deputy. I should say I wasn't aware of the background or the historical significance of the house and how it had been donated by the former Labour Senator Bobby Burke. I'm quite sure that the facility there is just as it's described by Deputy Kitt, and that there is a fine facility and the other services there, including primary care type services, which I'm very interested in and very supportive of, as indeed is Minister Lynch and the whole of the government. So I think I can just leave it by reiterating again that the situation is somewhat fluid. There was that meeting today to which I referred, and I'm sure the right decisions will be made in the circumstances.
Thank you, Minister. Item number 3, in the name of Deputy Gerald Nash to the Minister for Social Protection. The need to fast-track carers allowance payments to returned immigrants who come back home to care for family members. Deputy Nash. 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach. As the Minister will be aware, it can cost up to €2,000 per week to provide care to an older person in a residential nursing home in the public sector. It costs the state, though, about €200 per week for a carer, more often than not an immediate relative, to provide round-the-clock care for a parent, aunt or uncle in their own homes by way of the provision of the carer's allowance. But the state officially denies that basic level of support to emigrants who return home in a parent's time of need to look after the very people who took care of them when they were growing up. Because many returning emigrants don't satisfy the Department's habitual residency clause, they aren't officially entitled to receive any recognition or financial support from the state to carry out the caring duty they feel duty-bound to undertake. They don't qualify, as the Minister will be aware, for a carer's payment if they've not been resident in the state in the previous 2 years. The local community welfare officer also appears to be prevented from providing any support whatsoever to help a family make ends meet and to recognise the role of the carer under such circumstances. The habitual residency clause, as the House will be aware, was introduced for very good reason in May 2004, and nobody wants to see opportunistic exploitation of the social welfare system. But the kinds of situations I've experienced, such as this week, with a woman returning to Drogheda to look after her mother, who's awaiting an organ transplant and who does not meet the habitual residency requirements, demands, I think, that we take a review of this system and that we insist on a process that takes into account the reality of life and the need for the social protection system to respond in a humane manner which respects the dignity of the carer and the people for whom care is provided. We should, I think, identify a better way. There may be no more than a few hundred, maybe even fewer, people who experience this issue right across the country in any given year. At a small cost, I believe we could and should provide urgent assistance to families who most need help in a time of crisis and emotional strain, where specific sets of circumstances apply and where the returning emigrant is in some cases the carer of last resort for an ill or an infirm relative. Then I would urge the Department to take a less dogmatic and a more sympathetic role to the plight of carers who are returning emigrants and are returning on the basis of the need to care for an aged, ill or infirm relative.
Thank you, Deputy. Not a start.
Gurmagat, and I'd like to thank Deputy Nash for raising this issue, which, as you said, affects a relatively small number of people, but is a very important issue. And I'm taking it on behalf of my colleague Minister Burton, who is in the Shannon at the moment. The Department of Social Protection is committed to delivering the best possible service to its customers and continuously strives to achieve the highest standard of customer service possible. Carers allowance is a means-tested income support payment to people who are providing full-time care to a person who needs that care because of age, physical or learning disability or illness, including mental illness. At the end of October 2012, 51,550 customers were in receipt of carers allowance, approximately 23,000 of which are on half-rate carers, along with another primary social welfare payment. In 2011, the amount spent on carers allowance was €507 million. Expenditure on carers allowance over the last 10 years up to the end of 2011 has grown by almost 320%, and numbers of claimants in receipt of carers allowance has grown by almost 250% over the same period. The habitual residence condition applies to all social assistance payments, including carers allowance. The determination of a person's habitual residence is made in accordance with 5 factors which are set out in legislation as follows: the length and continuity of residence in the state or in any other particular country, the length and purpose of any absence from the state, the nature and pattern of the person's employment, the person's main centre of interest, and the future intentions of the person concerned as they appear from all the circumstances. These 5 factors have been derived from European Court of Justice case law. EU rules prevent discrimination on nationality grounds in relation to social security, so it's not possible to exempt a particular category of Irish citizen, such as returning emigrants, from the habitual residence condition, either in general or for carers allowance, without extending the same treatment to all EU nationals. However, the guidelines regarding determination of habitual residence address the issue of returning emigrants very specifically. The guidelines state a person who had previously been habitually resident in the state and who moved to live and work in another country and then resumes his or her long-term residence in the state may be regarded as being habitually resident immediately on his or her return to the state. And I hope that that is of help to Deputy Nash. In determining the main centre of interest in the case of returning immigrants, deciding officers take account of the purpose of return, the applicant's stated intentions, current and future, verified arrangements which have been made in regard to returning on a long-term basis, for example, transfer of financial accounts and any other assets, termination of residence-based entitlements in the other country, or assistance from Safe Home or a similar programme to enable Irish immigrants to return permanently, length and continuity of the previous residence in the state, the record of employment or self-employment in another state, and whether he or she has maintained links with the previous residence and can be regarded as resuming his or her previous residence rather than starting a new period of residence. This is generally sufficient to enable the deciding officer to determine whether their present circumstances in Ireland indicate a temporary visit or habitual residence. Relatively few returning Irish immigrants are refused social welfare payments on grounds of habitual residence. In 2011, 13,880 applications for carers allowance were processed. Of these, 223, approximately 1.6%, were refused on the basis of habitual residency, of which 42 were Irish nationals. It is acknowledged that the time taken to process carers allowance claims generally at present is unacceptable. The Department of Social Protection has implemented measures to improve the processing time for carers allowance applications, including the allocation of additional temporary resources. Following the completion of a major modernisation project, an in-depth business process improvement project was completed for the carers allowance scheme. This project focused on optimising output and customer service and the elimination of the current backlogs. The processing of claims has been divided into 2 streams. One concentrates on dealing with new claim intake and processes these without delay, and the other on the backlog, which is ring-fenced with a clear and targeted plan for its elimination. Since the implementation of the new processes, the Minister is happy to report that substantial inroads have been made to the current backlog and new applications are being processed on receipt.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Nash, further 2 minutes.
Thank you, Minister, for your detailed response. I think part of the problem here is a lack of clarity amongst the general public in relation to their claims and the way in which they may be handled in certain offices of the Department of Social Protection. It seems to me, and I've detected a pattern in recent times, whereby once the issue of habitual residency is put forward, then an official may, and this is not always the case, suggest that in fact there is very little point in making an application because the application would not be considered. So perhaps the Minister can clarify this for me. What I'm discerning from what you're saying is that there is perhaps an amount of flexibility or maybe an amount of misunderstanding in relation to how the process works. I just want to quote back at you, Minister, the reference made to, and I quote, a person who had previously been habitually resident in the state and had moved to live and work in another country and then resumes his or her long-term residence in the state may be regarded as being habitually resident immediately on his or her return to the state. So I think there probably is an acknowledgement there that in a case where an Irish citizen, an Irish national applies, that I suppose an amount of discretion may be applied by the Department of Social Protection in the consideration of an application for carers allowance. It's important, and the government, it's a stated objective of the government, it's important that we do support carers at every level of society. And you've outlined the approximate €500 million expended by the state in relation to carers allowance and half-rate carers allowance. That is a very, very important support provided indeed. There's a small number of people affected here, as the Minister has outlined. Last year, in 2011, 13,888 applications for carers allowance were processed. 1.6% were refused on the basis of habitual residency, and only 42 were Irish nationals. So I think a good job of work could be done to clarify the situation for returning emigrants who wish to apply for carers allowance to take care of a mother, father, aunt or uncle. There appears to be an amount of confusion out there. I think this discussion has clarified that, and I certainly would encourage those who are returning emigrants and are here to support their family members to go down the route of applying for a carers allowance and have all the necessary evidence and have a discussion with social welfare staff to ensure that the application is processed and progressed properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. And Taoiseach Dawes.
Yes, I think I would agree with Deputy Nash that there certainly appears to be quite a bit of flexibility here in terms of the various elements that the officers take into account, and indeed the part of my original contribution where I referred to the fact that the person can be regarded as being habitually resident immediately on his or her return. But I will certainly convey to Minister Burton the issues that you've raised, and I think particularly if there is a need for clarification for the people who are implementing these guidelines, then I'm sure the Department would be happy to give that clarification to ensure that people who are entitled are receiving the carers allowance or carers benefit, carers allowance particularly. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Item 4 is by Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan to the Minister for the Environment, Community and Local Government. The need to respond to the increase in homeless numbers from the recent Sleeping Rough report. The Deputy has 4 minutes for initial statement. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, and I'm really glad in the middle of all the Christmas festivities, and I know there are families struggling who will find Christmas difficult, but it will be business as usual for many, and we will see the spending in the shops and the pubs, the bars and on travel. So I think it's good that we don't lose sight of the people who are homeless, because there's a story behind every homeless person, and I don't think anybody makes a career decision to end up homeless. So I first want to, we're obviously representing Dublin Central, it is a major issue, the whole situation of homelessness. But there are great organisations. We have Simon, we have Focus, we have DePaul, we've also Vincent DePaul, Salvation Army, the Capuchin Centre, and also the local authority, Dublin City Council. And they are providing very vital services, whether it's an emergency service or whether they're trying to progress the strategies, the way home or pathway to home. And of course to acknowledge the great generosity of Irish people. And then there are other particular initiatives. For example, we have the one on the safety net. And the other point I think that has to be made is that it's difficult to get accurate information, and there's a whole pile of reasons for this. The whole concept is complex. So in homeless figures, do we include those who are squatting? Do we include those who are on a sofa for a night or who move from sofa to sofa? And do we include those people coming out of hospital, rehab or prison who have nowhere to go? But what we do know is what we can see on the streets, 5 minutes from here. We do know from the housing list, and we do know from the statistics, and the recent one from the Homeless Service in Dublin City Council, that there were 87 people sleeping rough and the month of November, which was the same as the previous month. We know there was the very sad death of a homeless person in Wicklow recently. There's an increase in Cork, and there was a very frightening statistic that from the beginning to the end of the Celtic Tiger, the number of homeless people in this country doubled. So the couple of points I wanted to bring out is, one is there are increasing demands on the services, but the services have the same or fewer resources. I want to make a point about those in addiction who are trying to stay clean, trying to stay sober, and yet they end up in the same accommodation as those who are still using or those who are still drinking. And I'm glad you're here, Minister, because on the property tax, if it is applied to the social housing associations, if it is applied to local authority who are struggling as it is with